Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's global lecture. My name is Chris Lubkeman. I have the pleasure and the privilege of leading the Strategic Foresight Hub within the Office of the President here at the ETH Zurich. And probably most importantly, I get to host this evening's conversation, which I'm super excited to do. The ETH Global Lecture Series is a platform where we bring remarkable people together to discuss personal insights, interests, experiences, and expertise on contemporary topics. In addition to simply satisfying our curiosity to learn, we also hope that these dialogues will expand our perspectives collectively in this room so we can broaden our thinking, challenge our opinions, and through this, make an even more meaningful contribution to society. And I think when we're looking at the state of the world, the state of where we are in many different domains, the lessons which we're going to hear tonight, I hope, will resonate with you because you've chosen to come, and you'll have lessons which you'll be able to take and share with others. Tonight, we're going to engage low-tech, design by radical Indigenism. And I'm delighted to be, did I get that right? Yeah, okay, good, just checking. Good. I'm delighted to be speaking with these two amazing individuals about this topic, which is very close to my heart. I spent 25 years in the built environment, and the built environment is upon which we thrive as a society. And we'll hear tonight about how lessons can be taken from thousands of years of insight. First, we're going to have Julia Watson speak, then our home team. Catherine DeWolf's going to speak. Then she and I, the three of us, are going to have a conversation. And then you're going to have a chance also to ask some questions of them. And we'll dialogue for about another 40 minutes. So I say that, so now be noting the questions you might want to ask. Because I guarantee you'll forget the first two questions. So you might want to write those down as you go through. Julia Watson is a designer, activist, academic, and author. She is a leading expert on indigenous nature-based technologies for climate resilient design. Julia coined the term low-tech, with TEK, which is derived from traditional ecological knowledge, and wrote the award-winning book, which is right up here, and all of you should make sure you order it. Book depository, it gets delivered right to your home. Okay. Did I do okay with that one? All right. Actually, it was a really good book, actually. Designed by Radical Indigenism, which is a cumulative body of multigenerational knowledge, practices, and beliefs, countering the idea that indigenous innovation is primitive and exists isolated from technology. It is essentially a movement which she is working to create and is creating to rebuild an understanding of local knowledge, technology, and vernacular design. So without any further ado, let us welcome Julia to the stage.
So thank you all for giving up your time. I know sometimes it's hard to get to places, hard to get to lectures. It's a real honor to be here and to see all of your faces and to talk to you about the work that I've spent the last 7, but really 20 years exploring. I do want to caveat by, if you hear me get out of breath, please excuse me. I'm 6.5 months pregnant, and my lungs are the size of little baby fists, with little baby fists punching them as well. So just be patient with me, and we'll get through this. So tonight, I want to talk to you about some really profoundly intelligent, incredibly beautiful, and deeply spirited landscapes, where humans have evolved technologies that work with nature rather than against it. And these are some places that you might have seen before, you might have even visited these places, but tonight I want to tell you a mythology about why these places are so incredibly and vitally important. 'to us all. To us all. So myth comes from the ancient Greek word mythos, meaning story of the people, and myths have guided mankind for millennia. And one of the oldest mythological threads of the Earth's indigenous people is that humans are part of nature. Shocking that we don't all understand this. Most indigenous languages don't even have a word for the concept of nature because they don't consider that humans are separate to nature. And traditionally, our role was to be the custodians of other life, both human and more than human, on this planet. But 400 years ago, intellectuals of the European Enlightenment, they constructed a myth that separated humans from nature. And this mythology of technology, it favored fuel by fire, and it feasted on the felling of forests and the extraction of resources, and it powered the age of industrialization. And it ignored this millennia-old local wisdom, deeming it primitive. And this mythology of technology, it actually caused us to forget local wisdom and innovation, and our single most important role as human beings, which is to be the custodians of life. And instead, we've actually become its greatest threat. And now the mythology of the dominant global culture focuses on either conquering nature in the name of progress or saving nature in the name of conservation. And today, nature has become this kind of construct that is subservient to either our superiority complex or our savior complex. However, humanity's real challenge is not going to be to save nature, it's going to be to learn how to work with nature. And so responding to this challenge is low tech, and it's a movement that considers local communities and their technologies an evolutionary extension of life in symbiosis with nature. So, as designers of the built environment, which I'm going to assume that many people in the room are, we really tend to focus, and it's not our fault, it's what we're taught, on dead cultures. And like the 4,000-year-old pyramids of Giza, so the problem with that is that we actually fail to then acknowledge really incredible living cultures and the innovations that they have created. And then we tend to forget the ancient mythologies that have guided cultures to live with climate extremes. Mythologies that are embedded with resilience thinking, that have been ingrained in cultural consciousness and passed down for sometimes thousands of years. And if we're talking about the communities from the country that I was born in, which is Australia, the First Nations of Australia, they've been in occupation for 40,000 years that we say to date. That's 1,600 generations of knowledge that have been passed down. It's these knowledge and their technologies that have now symbiotically support 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity. And in the 21st century, humankind's impact upon the Earth is once again causing a mass extinction, the Earth's sixth mass extinction. But I don't think that species loss, and this might go against some of the conservationists in the room, I don't think that species loss is what we're going to remember as being the most significant thing that happened in the 21st century. I believe that the 21st century will be remembered as the epoch that we lost the most valuable technology on this planet because we didn't even realize that it was technology. It's because those same forces that are driving species extinction, they're endangering local technologies as well, because the local technologies and the communities that create those technologies, they're the ones supporting the biodiversity on this earth. And these are the technologies that I talk about in low tech. So Chris told you a little bit about low tech, but I'm going to explain a little bit further about the ideas behind the book. So low tech is a combination of two words, local and TEK, or Traditional Ecological Knowledge, but it's also came up as a provocation towards the biases that the West has towards local people and the technologies. So it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek naming. And so until low-tech, when I was looking at these technologies and in different books and different sources, they were always called low-tech, L-O-W-T-E-C-H, which you're probably very familiar with this terminology, which is defined as primitive and unsophisticated technology, which none of these technologies actually are. And this was really the impetus behind giving a different conceptual understanding of what these technologies are in the book. Instead, these technologies are incredibly sophisticated technologies that include all of today's sustainability principles like low embodied energy and low cost and low maintenance. And I think low-tech actually even goes beyond sustainable. And so rather than forming closed loops, it actually forms continuous flows. And what this does, it makes these systems exponentially generative. And once, after a while, these systems become generative, they actually move towards becoming autonomous. And these systems are also governed by incredibly democratic, collaborative governance systems. So low-tech questions the dominant mythology of technology, which I spoke about in the beginning, which threatens our planet and shows us how humans have been living and thriving with nature, fulfilling our traditional role as custodians of all other life. It questions what we consider technology. It asks us to expand our understanding of technology and asks whether some of our most sustainable technologies were maybe just perhaps rooted in cultures who figured out climate solutions maybe 1,000 years ago. And these are innovations that have been evolved, as I said, and passed down through generations, through something we call deep time, sometimes 1,600 generations, 40,000 years. And they're actually evolved in response to flooding and fire and sea level rise and extreme weather events and food scarcity and water scarcity, which all sound familiar to us because they're all of the same conditions and extremes that we're experiencing today. And they're incredibly well adapted to their local environments and actually play a key role, as I said, in conserving biodiversity. So low-tech uses TEK, which is Traditional Ecological Knowledge, which is knowledge that has been universally ignored or exploited by Western science. And TEK is really broadly defined as a cumulative body of multigenerational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. So this is what this technology is composed of: knowledge systems, practices, resource management systems, and belief systems. And this is just a graphic to sort of help you understand and illustrate what that actually means, because it's different when it's a whole bunch of words, and then you can actually see maybe what this concept is. And it's a nested concept which you can explain with the individual at the top. Underneath that is that individual is their understanding of their local landscape and their plants and animals. Beneath that is your land and resource management systems. Then beneath that is your social institutions like ETH Zurich. And it's actually who you have access to, who you can influence, and who you collaborate with. And then beyond that, underneath that, is your worldview and your belief systems. And unbelievably, there are thousands of different worldviews and belief systems which understand how humans relate to their natural environments. It's not just superiority or savior. There's a massive diversity in the way of understanding human beings' relationship to their environment. So radical Indigenism is a rebuilding of knowledge. It's not something I made up, something somebody else made up. It's a concept that was made up by a professor of the Cherokee. She's a person of the Cherokee Nation, and she's a professor. And she talks about radical Indigenism as a rebuilding of knowledge through explorations of indigenous philosophies that are capable of generating new knowledge for Indigenous communities. So looking at mythology, looking at very old understandings and say, well, what is their relevance today and how can that create new knowledge for us? And so I took that concept and said, well, given a lot of Indigenous people are talking about having a voice and a platform in the discussions about climate change, let's bring these ideas into sustainability and design, and let's start to discuss how technologies and practices can be thought about as technologies for climate change thinking. And so as a designer, I think that solutions embedded in a community and in an environment are actually the most effective forms of resilience in scale. Low-tech is a movement that builds upon an understanding of these local solutions to generate sustainable climate-resilient infrastructures. So rather than continuing a very narrow view of technology that was informed by our distance from nature, we must acknowledge that the Enlightenment mythology of technology was just one way, and it's not the only way, for humankind to progress. And what we need is a new mythology that includes low-tech thinking to create a world where our built environment uses biodiversity as a building block, where marginalized histories and worldviews are centered, where a new mythology of custodianship guides some of our societal values. Now let's fast forward to the year 2040 and a project called the Symbiocene, which looks at how Indigenous technologies are invaluable to our collective understanding of and our response to the climate crisis. So this is a uniquely commissioned art piece that I did for the City of London, designed for the Our Time on Earth exhibition that was curated by Franklin Till. And Our Time on Earth is actually a major exhibition celebrating the power of global creativity to transform the conversation around the climate emergency. And first shown at the Barbican in London in summer last year, it's actually going to continue on the Musée de Civilisation in Quebec, in Canada this spring, and then it's going to the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts, USA. You could. Missed it. So Symbiocene presents 3 proposals of how Indigenous technologies could be applied to cities in the year 2040 to make them more resilient to climate breakdown without contributing to it. It was designed in collaboration with the Wakasi of northeastern India, the Madan of southern Iraq, and the Subak farming cooperatives of Bali. And each technology that we created was based on nature-based strategies that were developed in collaboration with these communities. And these hybrid technologies were represented through architectural models which were overlaid with video projections. So working with engineers from Bureau Happold and the 3 communities, the Symbiocene creates what I think of as a playbook for how Western designers can collaborate with Indigenous knowledge keepers to create technologies for the built environment. And it's a first step in trying to understand how that collaboration can occur. And so what I'd like to do now is actually take you through the 3 technologies from the communities that they have created, which we worked with, and then show you the hybrid adaptations of those technologies for the urban environment that came out of that process for the year 2040. So these are the living root bridges of the Wakasi, who are a community who live in northeast India in a very remote location in a place called Meghalaya, and this place receives the most rainfall of any place on Earth. And what they've done is they've evolved this amazing living bridge innovation where they actually grow the bridges over the stream so they can travel between villages in the monsoon. So this is one of the bridges. There's 73, well, there used to be 73. Just in this last summer, they lost 7 bridges because of increased impact from the monsoonal rains. First time that has ever happened before and attributed to climate change. So these are the Ficus elastica trees, and these are the only bridges that are able, at this point in time, to really withstand the rain and the really, really wet environment that occurs here. And the bridges are created by guiding and growing living tree roots that you can actually barely wrap your arms around through a carefully woven scaffolding of bamboo that then rots away and disappears, and you're left with a woven bridge structure. And it's a 1,500-year-old tradition of growing these living root bridges, and they also create ladders, and they create swings, and they're now creating houses, and they're still innovating and evolving the methods of construction that they're using and creating from these ficus elastica trees. And so, as I said, they had produced over 70 structures, and they take about 50 years to grow, these bridges, before you can travel across them. A lot of them are about 150 years old at the moment. They'll live to about 350 to 400 years. And in this landscape, they actually just last for centuries. And multiple generations of the Kasi men actually care for the roots until they've grown to the opposite side of the bank when they plant the trees. Once the roots have grown further enough to the opposite side of the bank, they then plant the roots into the ground. The tree keeps growing, and that's when the rest of the community gets involved. And women and children actually then help maintain these bridges over time. So this is the technology created, and it was inspired by these living root bridges. And what we did was we designed a living canopy and walkway that creates an urban transportation network that actually grows with a city. And this infrastructure was designed to actually really significantly decrease urban heat island effect while increasing biodiversity and creating a really changed, comfortable microclimatic condition for pedestrians. And it was modeled alongside working with the community and really trying to get an understanding of how these bridges work, what are the sort of jointing systems called inosculation, where two different species of plant can actually grow together to create one. And it was really targeted as a non-specific site, but for Indian cities, which we now know, 70% of those cities are experiencing over 40 degrees days, 70% throughout the year. So still indigenous to that particular landscape and that particular country, but thinking about a different application for those bridges. Second technology is the Al-Tala Islands of the Medan in southern Iraq, and they create an islanding and housing system made from a single species of reed, which is called the kasab. And the Medan make these islands several ways, but one of the ways they make them is by creating a living fence around these kasab reed. And then they build up layers of mud and dried reed, and over time, they build a platform that's actually alive. And over time, the process of decomposition keeps these islands buoyant. So there's also these arched houses, which you can see in the diagrams, which are from the book. And they're really easily identified, these particular houses. They're called the Marif. They're very, very unique to this community, and we've seen them depicted in Sumerian Uruk imagery. So we know that this type of construction method is actually 6,500 years old. And as you can see in this clip, the kasab reed is actually really, they're putting together, sort of creating the foundations and these sort of foundational columns, which they counterweight to create those arches into the ground here. But it's really integral to every aspect of life for the Medan people. They actually feed this root and this grass to the buffalo. They make flour, which they eat this flour, they make bread. It's a building material that creates these biodegradable, buoyant islands in these houses. And these houses can be constructed in as little as 3 days and then deconstructed and moved to another location. And so the dried reed is actually incredibly versatile as well. And it can be bundled into these columns and then bundled into these rafters and then woven into mats for the floor and for the roofs and for the walls. And then in a final stage, they actually twist it into a rope that's then used to bind the whole building together because they're not using any form of metal fasteners to create this building. And these Medan villages stay afloat for about 25 years. So modeled from the Al-Tala Islands and the Marif houses, this is a floating community infrastructure for an adaptive waterfront neighborhood. So rather than forced relocation, communities affected by rising waters can actually adapt using buoyant, biodegradable infrastructures. And these types of islands support habitation both above and below the waterline by human and more than human users. And the last technology is the Subak of Bali, which is actually an underground water tunneling system and an above-ground terraforming that transforms the island of Bali from a really, really rugged, unarable landscape into the rice bowl of this area. And the Subak is the name of the system, but it's also the name of the 1,200 self-governing farmer collectives who share water and planting schedules. And the Subak terraces have produced rice for thousands and thousands. The same terrace, the same individual terrace, has produced rice for thousands of years, and they work at the scale of watersheds. And what is protecting that is the mountain landscape that is protected above, which is the sacred land. And that sacred land that is the forest that they've protected to allow these terraces to work for 1,000 years retains the volcanic soil. And then when the monsoon rains come, the monsoon rains take all the minerals and the nutrients from that volcanic soil and they wash all of that natural fertilizer down annually or biannually back into these rice terraces to re-fertilize them. There's no fertilizer used, there's no pesticides used, and what the farmers do so they don't have to use pesticides, at the scale of massive watersheds, they all sync up their cycles of flooding their terraces and then releasing all that floodwater so that pests have nowhere to sort of move and migrate between terraces. And it's all controlled by the water temples, by the religion. And the Subak transforms these really unusable hillsides into incredibly productive land. And many species really rely on these terraces for food and for water and for shelter. And now indigenous rice terraces are really considered one of the world's most important ecosystems. And they act as these massive absorption and purification systems and as nutrient and biodiversity storehouses. And so what we did, based on the Subak technology, is created a nature-based water sharing and cleansing infrastructure that captures rainwater and runs it through a diverse system of natural subterranean treatments and wetlands, resulting in varying grades of water that can be siphoned off for different uses within a community. And that water, when it comes out of the system, it's either funneled into agriculture or then clean water is funneled back into our river systems. So a fourth and unplanned technology also emerged, which I'll play across the screen here. It's a legal technical innovation that addresses Indigenous intellectual property rights. And it seeks to bridge the difference that we found in this process of working with the communities, which was Western contract law and Indigenous notions of shared ownership. And so what usually happens when Indigenous knowledge is shared, for example, in the biotech industry, is an MOU is put in place. And the MOU is really asymmetrically aligned towards Western contract law and Western Indigenous intellectual property. And so to replace that, and in line with Indigenous knowledge being oral rather than written, we created an SOU. It's a smart oath of understanding. It's a 9-part oral contract written in aspirational language, which strips away the MOU to its really bare legal essence. And the SOU plays as a sound shower in the space. It's spoken by the CEO of Bureau Happold, which is the company that we worked with in creating these technologies. And then it's responded to by Morningstar Kathau of the Wakasi community, Wayan Alid Wiguna of the Subak, and Jassim Al-Asadi of the Madan. And then it was translated by myself because they actually speak and respond in their Indigenous dialects. And it was really designed to be entered into through an unalterable smart contract, which are transparently encoded into public blockchains. So these aren't written laws, these are laws that go immediately into effect through public blockchains, and they exist in perpetuity and transparently. And so we envision that the SOU could actually evolve into a Nagoya Protocol-esque framework for transparently tracking the flow of Indigenous intellectual property that's associated with a different type of benefit and value sharing and pledges related to Indigenous resources and their technologies. So we're drowning in information while we're starving. for wisdom. And low-tech is a movement seeding creativity in crisis, inspired by a multitude of ideas informed by many of the world's belief systems and mythologies, and a diversity of beliefs about technology born from climate extremes. And we need a new mythology that really isn't grounded in our superiority complex, and we need to write a new mythology informed by the knowledge of communities who have no word for nature in their language because they're not separate from it. And the modernist mythology of technology that saw us as superior to nature was wrong. And we need to relearn that life is a symbiosis, it's a reciprocity, it's a collaboration, which is a relationship with a common benefit. And if we protect life, we protect ourselves. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. Very inspiring. And I took 2 pages of notes, so I can't wait to ask you. And next, I'd like to invite to our stage our home team member, Catherine de Wolf. An incredible journey. She has an incredible ability to connect engineering with architecture, computer science, and art to respond to today's pressing environmental issues. And perfect response, especially to this last little bit which we just heard. This is really great. She practices her bridge building at places such as MIT, Cambridge, Arup, and now as a professor here at ETH, focused on circularity and regenerative built environment. So, Catherine, the stage is now yours. Very good.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Julia, for this really inspiring talk, and I think it ties in really well, and thanks for also talking about the hybridization, because my work is also a lot about digital technologies that can help us for a climate-resilient future in the construction sector. And so I work a lot on technologies for circularity. And here you see this picture of Lego. Since I was little, I always liked to play with Lego because I like to build something, then unbuild it, and then build something new with these blocks. And I think that's probably what got me into circular architecture, which is about reuse a lot. And as an adult, it's fun to do that in real life with real buildings. And maybe you recognize this city. I mean, the buildings coming up is kind of a giveaway as well. It's the Centre Pompidou in Paris. And I was lucky enough to work for the engineering company that did the renovation of this facade. So they had to replace all of this beautifully bent glass due to changing security norms. And instead of throwing away the glass, we reached out to our entire network of architects we know in Paris, because surely someone wants to reuse this iconic glass. And so we found someone who was motivated enough to disassemble carefully this glass, and then design something really beautiful with the bent glass that could still be used as partitioning walls. Now, this process was really time-consuming, and I thought, surely there must be technologies that we can use to make this more smooth, faster, and cheaper. And so that kind of motivated me to start this chair here at ETH and to become a professor, because I think it's the best way to keep on learning my whole life long. And so I like to learn a lot from history, from culture, my own culture, but also other cultures, from nature, because nature has billions and billions of years of experience with developing technologies, but also from the digital technologies, the more newer, more emergent technologies. So let's start with the historical lesson I learned. So this is the Pantheon in Rome, which is a concrete dome that has been standing there for 2,000 years. And I not only learned from the amazing self-healing capacities that it has when cracks appear, and the amazing structural optimization that it did, but also from the fact that it's just been there for 2,000 years. And it shows that when we value the materials that we put into our built environment, we can respect them enough so that they stay. Here's another concrete dome. Have you ever seen this dome before? Who has seen this dome before? My students should raise their hand because they have seen it in class this afternoon. So this is the King Dome in Seattle. And it's also a concrete dome, and it was also designed to last 1,000 years. But this is what happened only 24 years after its construction. And today we see increasingly shorter lifespans of buildings. I mean, maybe some of you have seen the video that went viral on Twitter this week with some high-rises that were demolished because they were inoccupied or unfinished because contractors went bankrupt. And so it seems a bit silly that we put all of this embodied carbon, all of the pollution that we put into extracting these materials, making these materials, constructing these buildings, to then just demolish it and then produce a gigantic amount of waste. So that's why I teach my students to deconstruct buildings for the reuse of their materials rather than demolishing buildings. I see some of my students laughing because they're on the picture. So here we went to a building not so far from Zurich where we disassembled the entire building in only 2 days with my students. This building was set for demolition, so we were able to save all of these materials. They are now at the ETH campus, and we're going to build a new structure with them on the campus. So this enables us to then go into digital technologies, for example, computational design algorithms that can help us look at the available stock of materials and design new structures with the available stock. Instead of extracting raw materials to build something out of the blue, we designed something with the available stock. So here we looked at how many domes we could design, and then because we like construction, we also built some of them with the materials that we disassembled. Now, why did we build domes? Because I'm a bit of a fan of Buckminster Fuller. He said to change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Now, that's kind of what I want to do with making the linear model of extraction, taking, using, and throwing away. I want to make that obsolete and go towards a circular model in which we reuse our waste materials as resources. And Julia also in her book mentions that in nature, everything is a resource. There is no waste. And that's really what I want to go towards. But to make this circular model replace the previous model that we have currently, the linear model, we need to develop technologies that make this circular model faster, cheaper, more common sense, better than what we have today. Now, Buckminster Fuller also said, how much does your house weigh? When he was designing the Dimension House. And that got me thinking, and I started to collect thousands of building material quantities and started a PhD where I looked at the embodied carbon of thousands of buildings worldwide. And here are a few stadiums. Do you recognize these stadiums? So the Bird's Nest on top in Beijing and the London Olympic Stadium. So can you guess which one has the highest embodied carbon? Who thinks it's the Bird's Nest? Who thinks it's the London Olympic Stadium? All right. Well, when I did this database, I was really surprised to find that Bird's Nest has more than 10 times the embodied carbon compared to the London Olympic Stadium. So I thought, for the same function, how can we have such a big difference in terms of embodied carbon? And what happened between 2008 and 2012, when those two stadiums were built, is that there was a shift more towards sustainability in design. And it was really a goal for the London Olympic Stadium to be more sustainable. And I thought, well, if we just put goals in the beginning of the design phase, we can really have an impact. So as a designer, we really have an impact. Now, when I started at MIT for my PhD, I was also the teaching assistant of my advisor, John Oxendorf, for the class History of Structures. And he had done some studies on Inca structures. And I thought this was really amazing, and he encouraged me to go and travel to Peru, and we talked about this earlier with Julia as well. But what really amazed me was this Winchiri Bridge, not so far from the Machu Picchu. This bridge is built, it has been there since the Inca times. Every year, the villagers on both sides of the river come together in a 3-day festival where they cut the grass and weave this into this bridge, which is actually very strong. So just growing grass can turn into a strong bridge just by using the right design. Another kind of inspired by the growing of nature, is this example of Neri Oxman in the mediated matter group at MIT, where she was growing the famous silk pavilion, where she ordered a bunch of silkworms, put them on this digitally fabricated structure, and then they did the rest of the growing. And I think this is very interesting to be inspired by nature, to say we grow our architecture instead of assembling it. So another material that grows really fast is bamboo. It's an incredibly renewable material, and it's also really strong because it's built itself naturally in the shape that you need, where you need the materials where they are in a bamboo column. And here you see an example of a cathedral that was made with bamboo. And this is to show also you don't only need strong materials, you also need to have them where they are good at. And here is the paper palace by Shigeru Ban, which, when you think about it, it's made out of paper, but it spans a really big space. And this is also what I find very inspiring when you use the material where it's good for. When you design it so that the forces flow, it really needs much less material. Here is the Mapungupu Interpretation Center, designed by Peter Rich architects, and one of my colleagues, Philippe Bloch, also worked on it. We happen to have the same PhD advisor who works on this project as well. And this was inspired by the Guastavino tile vaulting system, which enables us to use a very thin vault for spanning large spaces. And these are earthen tiles. So they have a very low embodied carbon. They're actually very weak. You can break them with your own hands. But by putting them in that shape, it becomes really strong. This is the Ise Shrine in Japan, and Guy Norderson, a famous engineer, gave me this picture because he had the privilege to assist this religious ritual, sacred ritual that happens every 20 years. They disassemble the shrine, and they built exactly the same shrine. And the aim of this ritual is also to transmit the knowledge of, for example, Japanese joinery to the next generation, from one craftsman to the next. And so I think what is very interesting here is also about the transmission of knowledge. And Julia also talks a lot about this in her book. It's about not losing this knowledge and this technology. So we did this also here in Switzerland. These are cabins built for a school here in Switzerland, a school in the forest, so that they have to disassemble and reassemble it every 3 months to go to another place in the forest. And we looked at the ancient technology that is used here in Switzerland for what they call jacquards, which are granaries, where the farmers used to keep the food. And they had this system that was before we even used screws or glues. And so this is very disassemblable by nature, and really inspired the students to build these little cabins that could be disassembled and reassembled by the students. And so because it's about transmission of knowledge, this was built with the little students who were 5, 6 years old and their parents, so that we did this transmission of knowledge to the next generation. And they had a lot of fun. They also learned about circular economy principles, using local materials, reusing materials, and so on. Now, this is the roof of a yurt that I helped build. And you see this reciprocal roof is also inspired by an ancient technology that has been used in Japanese and Chinese architecture since the 12th, 13th century. And it's a really simple concept so that it stands and that you still have this light opening, and was able to make this roof for this yurt. Here is another roof. This is more inspired by a Mongolian yurt. And this happens to be the roof of my house where I used to live in Belgium, which is here. Now you see what my house looked like. And when I got the faculty position here in Switzerland, I had to move to Switzerland. And so we disassembled in a few days this entire yurt, sold it to another couple who is happily living in it on their land. And our land just looked like when we found it. So we left really no trace of our living there. Another example from Belgium is this Horta. So Horta is a famous Art Nouveau architect, and this was a Maison du Peuple, disassembled in 1965. And they thought this structure was so beautiful that they kept it for 35 years until they found a new home for the place. And this is again coming back to what I was saying, when you value your materials, your structure, your craftsmanship, your traditions, then you put in the effort to do the reuse of the structure. This is the Hortazaal in Antwerp, also in Belgium. So with my students, we went there and took some LiDAR scanners with us from the University of Ghent, and then LiDAR scanned the entire place, because our lab is doing digital technologies that can help us with circular construction. We build point clouds out of them. We use computer vision to recognize the materials and to map and digitize the building stock so that we can then easily do the reuse afterwards. We also look at the city scale. So this is a map of Zurich. We look at cadastral data, public record data, and here you see, for example, the different periods of construction of Zurich, but we also look a lot at image-based data. And Julia mentioned that we are drowning in information and starving for wisdom. And I saw this, like all of this data that we have available, all of these images that we have today, can we find some patterns in those images that we can learn something from to do something good? And so one of my PhD students developed some machine learning algorithms that can help identify which buildings have which materials in the building stock. When will they be demolished? When will they be renovated? When will these materials become available for reuse? So here you see the recognition of windows, the different materials, even cracks, the condition of the materials, thanks to this data. So once we've identified buildings that are set for demolition and that we cannot save anymore, we go and actually deconstruct them so that we can save some material. So here you see me disassembling a pipe, but then the pipe turned out to be too weak for the connection that we wanted to build for the dome. And so we used digital fabrication on this OSB board that we were going to throw away otherwise, and this strengthened the pipe. So the pipe became a connection thanks to digital fabrication technologies. So this is a Belgian artist who said, this is not a pipe, and I think I like to show this because when you see a pipe, it doesn't mean it needs to be a pipe tomorrow. We can be creative about what materials can be, and it can become connections. Now, if you want to give an identity to the materials, it can help give them a second life. And we've done this since Babylonian times, stamping bricks, for example. Here you see an image of a wall in Nanjing, which is where I used to teach a class. And you see that they have marked the brick manufacturer. It's to know whether who made it in case something goes wrong. They can see who is responsible, right? But it also gives information about when it was constructed, what is in the material, and so on. It's a material passport, in a way. So we now look at RFID chips, NFC chips, QR codes, and so on, that we can easily scan and then link to a database about what is in the material, what is in the building, so that we can reuse it at the end of life of a building. So we engraved QR codes in the timber beams that we disassembled from this building we deconstructed, and each single beam in this dome, you can scan and know where the material was before, what are the dimensions, what is the type of wood, and so on. And the aim is to connect then someone who has a building to demolish, that wants to reuse the materials, and someone who wants to design with reused materials, create a Tinder for reuse. And so that brings me to what Chris was saying when he introduced me. I like to connect things, I like to connect people, I like to connect history, culture, nature, science, technology, engineering, architecture, design, and art with each other, but most importantly, people. And I'm very happy that I connected back with Julia, back with my students also today, and with my colleagues and all of the audience here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. You have sort of these two, for me, barbells within an ellipse. So the whole thing I don't think we, in a living bridge, will have any barcodes.
Yeah, no.
I don't think so.
Not currently.
But in the end of the
They
day,
have genetic identities, actually.
what's that?
They have genetic identities.
Exactly. That's even better.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting you talked about blockchain technology, and I didn't talk about that, but that's also a technology we use in our research.
So, does anybody have a question yet? Okay, good. That's great. Then I can ask a few. So, I really liked this idea of deep time, and I'm trying to reconcile deep time with what Catherine was talking about. Because deep time is hundreds of generations. I'm trying to think, where does deep time come into that? And it doesn't have to, but how do you see that?
I mean, Catherine showed a lot of examples and inspirations from traditional building technologies where reuse was part of the culture, and it was before joinery systems and different types of industrial manufacturing process. So I think there's that sort of basic connection. But actually, what I wanted was to finish speaking a little bit earlier and show you what some of the people in the workshop said that I was showing on the screen. And they actually said, we don't know how you would build one of these bridges in 20 years because there's so much that goes into these bridges, knowledge, but we also ask the spirits of the rivers, where can we build these bridges? And I don't know, and he said, I don't know how to answer that for you, but we do know that we need to work together because we are having impacts from climate change now. We've lost 7 bridges. So how can you help us and how can we help you? And I think that even though there's this generational knowledge, mostly what I'm saying is don't just look to the future and forget about the past. We have knowledge systems that we've had for thousands of years, so why do we ignore them? Just expand it.
Because many of our climates have gone through variations over time.
Yeah.
If you look at 1,600 generations, then they will have experienced this. And how do we tap into that? It's a really fascinating question. And I also liked how you said, I was trained as an architect and engineer both, and we looked at dead cultures. I love that. So where would you suggest for our students to look, or for us to look, for the living lessons that are maybe closer? It's hard for me to go to Bali, but where else would you say we should go for inspiration?
I mean, one thing is interesting. I started doing this technology when I was teaching this research when I was teaching at Columbia, and so many of my students were international. I think the international ratio was 90% to 10%. And one of the projects in the class that I was teaching, which was contemporary technology, I would say, so where do you come from? Can you look for a landscape eco-technology where you come from, and can you present that? And it was so interesting that students from Indonesia or from India or from Korea or even from Hawaii, they would come to me and they would present and say, I had no idea that these types of technologies existed in the locations that I think I'm incredibly familiar with. And so I think that that's kind of putting that back to you guys. If you come from Switzerland, then go and look for technologies that come from here and go and investigate and do explorations. Or, in the new book that's coming out, which is called Low-Tech Water, we're looking at aquaculture systems from the 11th century that are in Venice, in the Venice Lagoon and connected to the Venice Lagoon, and they're also land building technologies. We're looking at aquaculture technologies in the Czech Republic that have been around from the 12th century. So there are technologies out there. And also a lot of the time people say, well, there's no technologies in Western countries. There absolutely are. There are ancient technologies that still exist that may not be 1,600 generations. Maybe they're 20 generations, but there's still technologies that you can start to understand how to create these sustainable systems and start to impact the type of industrial frameworks that have really become core establishments of how we live and how our mechanisms in society work, and say, well, maybe this doesn't work anymore because we need those feedback systems. We need to understand those inputs and outputs that maybe are a little bit more intangible now because we're all being impacted by climate change.
And if I may add, you mentioned that we are taught as designers, as architects, and engineers about dead cultures, and that's so true. And when we have a class on history of architecture, we talk about the pyramids. And this was really something that I was missing in my education, is saying, where can I learn about these technologies? And I had the chance that my advisor had done some studies on Inca structures, and that got me interested, but I was really thinking, this is really lacking in our education, these learnings about these other technologies. And so when your book came out, I was so happy. I was like, okay, I have something that I can show my students, someone who did really deep academic research also in other technologies than the ones that we get taught traditionally in our education.
Yeah, and I said, well, the reason I wrote the book was because I wanted to read the book and I wanted to know about these technologies. And I was fortunate enough to go to an architecture school where every single student in second-year architecture had to take a course called Aboriginal Environments, and we were taught about Indigenous technologies and Indigenous building in the built environment, and that just sort of shifted. I was like, it was like someone took a curtain back and was like, actually, this is part of your history. This is the landscape you inhabit, and this is what you should understand about it. And it was like really, I think, a really pivotal point. So I think building these concepts and ideas and pedagogies into what we teach is incredibly fundamentally important, and with the connection towards climate change and decarbonization as well.
So that was in Brisbane, or where was?
I was in Brisbane, Australia, yeah.
Busy. Yeah, that's great. Anyone have a question yet? There's two, not enough. Okay. Keep working on it. Come on, this is ETH. This is Zurich. You're supposed to, all right. I have one more, and then I'm going to get to you. Knowledge transfer. You both have mentioned knowledge transfer. And you talk about and we need the wisdom transfer, not just the knowledge transfer. What should we be doing? I'll come to you. How do you believe we need to be morphing so that we truly have this wisdom rather than purely just knowledge transfer? Because I loved how you said there's this big difference between the two, right? Information, data, information. That little wisdom at the top we seem to be losing it in many domains. Any ideas what we might be doing, should be doing differently?
No, we should be asking the people who hold the wisdom how we should be using it, number one, which we don't do, and involving them in that conversation. And, I think it's part of this idea of this mythology of technology and how we understand systems and how we disconnect and silo everything, and really looking at the values and understandings of some of these knowledge systems about this idea of reciprocity and this idea of holistic connectivity, and sort of this idea that, some of our fundamental understanding of sustainability actually comes from the great law of the Iroquois, which is the seventh generation principle. So we have built into some of our cultural consciousness these types of ideas, and some of this wisdom, it's not acknowledged, because actually the Germans say that they actually came up with the concept of sustainability based upon the Breckholt report, which was looking at different types of forestry systems. So there's even sort of this
compatibility. Let's don't go to the roots of that.
Yes, but I think that we are sort of exploring, and that's what radical Indigenism is. It's like, let's begin those investigations about this type of knowledge, and ask how can this knowledge be used, and ask for guidance, and to think about what is the new knowledge that can evolve from that.
Great, thank you. What about
when I think about wisdom, I think about things I learned from people who I consider more wise, and what I said earlier also about my reason of becoming a professor is because it enables me to keep on learning, keep doing research. I learn from my students, and I think there is a need for being humble about how much you know and how much you still have to learn, and that you will still keep on learning, right? And I think that's the reason I'm interested in all kinds of technologies, because I'm just so curious to learn more. I just want to learn and keep on learning.
So I completely hear you that, I was at Arab for 20 years, and the founder of Arab wrote a little ditty, which he said, knowers of truth are a bore, seekers of truth I adore. I kind of like that, the seekers of truth I adore. This is both, you're looking for, how do you seek what you look for? Okay, now it's time for you. We have 2 mic runners. Now put your hands back up really high. Who wants there? We got, oh my, there's fewer questions now. What, did they leave? Come on, okay. We have someone right here in the middle. You put your hand up right in the first, right here. Here's one right here. And the second is in the back right. So we're going to come up with her first, and you'll be next. And then you can go ahead and give him the mic right there. And then, yes, ma'am, you're next. Go.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really inspirational. Regarding the oath of understanding and the legal framework that or beyond the legal framework that you're using, do you also work at the intersection of rights, land rights especially, or how do you embed in your work a counter-colonization or a decolonization of sustainability practices, be it within the academy or within the practices that you use? Because that for us
I don't work in that area of activism at all. If any sort of activism, I talk about it as design activism, really advocating for designers to be activists and advocates for changes within the field. And I think the discussions that we have surrounding low-tech actually take a very different position or a complementary or a position of allyship that is separate to the types of activism that you're referring to, and bring up different subjects and different things. So, for example, we're writing with the community a chapter about a floating technology in India, which was, about 1,300 floating islands that have been created on this lake by this particular community that have lived there for forever. And the government 2 years ago in the Ministry of Environment decided to set the islands on fire. And so about 700 families lost their homes because the government just decided we don't want this anymore in this landscape, they're doing the wrong thing. And so by talking about these technologies and explaining the cultural histories and elevating these technologies to something that we can consider as ways of dealing with climate resilience and an inundation from flooding, we're starting to change the conversation about what the communities, and these are communities that don't have land, they're an aquatic environment, but they're still being persecuted. And so it's starting to change the conversation around that discussion of activism and creating sort of a separate stream of conversation that I think as designers we can have agency with regard to.
Great question, great answer. It's officially time. Is it okay if we keep going for 10 more minutes or so? Are you good with that? All in favors, put your hands up. All opposed? Direct democracy at work. I like it. There we go. Yes, sir.
Is this on? Yeah. Thanks very much. Really great talks. I was really interested and excited by what you're both presenting. I've got a kind of comment and a question. The comment is whether we are perhaps over-mythologizing these cultures themselves. So, for example, indigenous communities in Australia, going back 40, 50, 60,000 years even, have actually completely transformed the Australian landscape, leading to mass extinctions of marsupials 40, 50,000 years ago. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh is a great example where, one of the earliest, the earliest epic in history states that Gilgamesh, the king of Sumer, wanted to destroy and cut down the cedar forests and take control of it. So, in these cultures, there is a sense of domination, of even extermination of nature for the benefit of humankind. So the comment is maybe we should avoid over-mythologizing.
No, I think there's plenty of examples of communities who've actually completely, Easter Island, where they've just gone to extreme lengths of completely eroding and creating such an ecological impact that the society has become destroyed. And we can learn from that as well, 100%. But what we have right now is a position where we can see technologies that are resilient to climate change that have been completely disregarded and talked about as primitive, but yet they can provide us with different types of infrastructures if we work with those communities to understand how new technologies can be evolved. And so I think that we can understand that lens, but we can also include a new lens as well. And I don't think we should ignore that lens. And I don't think anybody's saying that this is like a pristine, perfect. We talk about in the book that there are terrible things happening inside of these landscapes. There's the oversaturation of resources, there's destruction, there's pollutions, and we talk about that. And the peoples and communities, they talk about that as well. So we do actually give both sides of the story, and we're very delicate to actually trying to create this, not an illusion of perfection, but that these are people living in a contemporary time in ways that are alternative to this modern conception of progress.
So the question, if I may, very briefly, I grew up in Iraq as a child until the age of 14. I lived with the Madan because my uncle was an anthropologist. So, spent quite a lot of time with them. It was absolutely amazing experience, but also very uncomfortable. Many of the Madan don't actually want to live in these houses anymore. They want to move to the cities and so on. So the question is, how do we get these communities to actually recognize what they actually have and continue to work with it?
I mean, and the Madan is a really interesting topic. I just wrote an introduction to a book that's all about the mythology and charting the history in the last 50 years. And even just recently, last week an article came out about what's happening in that landscape. And Saddam Hussein came and drained the entire marshes. And then the person that I've worked with on the book, he was one of the guys who actually pulled down those dikes with an excavator that they'd borrowed from some ministry. And they were all scared that they were going to be arrested and persecuted, but they still did it. And then they reflooded the entire marsh system. And then other ministries and officials said, well, this is a good thing, so we're going to keep going. So and most of the communities that I actually research with and work with, a lot of the persecution happens internally, from the governments internally towards and you could say, towards the territory, the people who are occupying, or the occupying governments. And now, the image that I showed of the marshes, actually, they don't look like that anymore. They have had so much adaptation, even in the last 15, 20 years, and we worked with the Madan, and the two guys that we worked with, they're both ministry officials, they're both excellent engineers and activists, and they adapt their systems now to incorporate plastic and sometimes tin roofs, so they don't always look like those types of environments. And then that's where I think, collaborations with what Catherine's talking about, and what I suggest as a future extension of this work is this idea of this hybridization. And part of the platform of low-tech is to say, I'm going to give this person a platform to say, this is the incredible innovation that we have, that we've had it for 500 years, 1,000 years. My government doesn't recognize this innovation. My government is actually persecuting me related to this innovation. Can I have a voice through you and through this work? So, I think there's a couple of responses there, but...
That's great.
Yeah,
thank you.
It's about hybridization of those technologies and not ignoring any technologies that could be helpful for climate resilience in the future.
And also realizing that because someone might be indigenous to a specific site, it doesn't mean that they don't engage with contemporary technologies. So many of the communities I work with, they're very versatile with information technology, and that's also why we created this smart oath of understanding, because realizing that most of these communities have smartphones, and the smart oath of understanding was we collaborated with Indigenous intellectual property experts, and they were saying this is what we're all talking about. There's a radical Indigenous renaissance that's happening related to what is the future of indigeneity in this world, and how can it infiltrate with this idea of progress and adapt it. And we want to be involved, and we're interested in technology, and we want technology to assist us. What they say is we're going to take that technology and we're going to adapt it for our use and decentralize it and take it out of the framework of a globalized, interconnected culture, because we want to retain our sovereignty. So there's some really interesting things happening surrounding that idea of already futurism and technology related to indigeneity.
That's great. Thank you. Great answer. We have another question right here. Yep, you've got the mic, I think, in your hand, right?
I
or
don't
no?
know how many there are.
Okay, I didn't want to surprise you with
Yeah,
that one. Yeah, okay.
surprise. Thank you. Well, so maybe one of the things, that ETH prides itself on, and a lot of certainly MIT, is the number of patents we have and the number of publications we have and how we market and we sell our innovations. And so, as a follow-up to the previous question, how do you attribute ownership and, unfortunately, financial restitution to the people who develop these technologies, especially within the conversations around decolonization?
Yeah.
More than just sharing and pledges.
I'll try to give a short answer to that one. if
Yeah,
I may.
as short as you can.
I actually just met recently with the World Intellectual Property Organization to talk to them about how they're thinking about intellectual property and presented the SOOU. And what we got back was like, well, we're doing something with patents and we're patenting cultural heritage. And I was sitting there with the lawyer that co-authored that, and we were saying, but we're not talking about patenting. That's trying to fit Indigenous knowledge into a system that it doesn't necessarily fit in. And why do we keep on doing that? And why do we keep on saying that Indigenous knowledge systems, and knowledge transfer has to fit into a Western framework? Why can't the Western framework adapt to accommodate different types of thinking, more holistic types of thinking? And why can't we start an SOOU is basically a new type in the same vein of patenting, but saying, let's think of this differently. And what we're patenting is actually the genetic material from the individual place to say, if we have a living root bridge, we can look at the genetic material that composes that bridge. We can understand where it comes from in terms of the soil, in terms of the waterfall, the types of climate that it comes from. And we can say that that information belongs to that community, and anybody who starts to make those types of bridges that are taking that type of understanding from that community, that's their connection to that community. So we can create ownership through an understanding of where a genetic stamping on that technology, and then write that code of that genetic technology into the blockchain.
But they don't get money.
I mean, it's an art project. It hasn't actually happened in the real world. It's a proposition to try and change the way people will think. The suggestion is, if we get to move this forward, if Bureau Happold and they've agreed, if they were to move this forward, it would then go into creating a system of a DAO where there's people who are, talking to Indigenous communities, and we're sort of coming to that conversation of like, what are we doing? But the suggestion is that we would actually go to a length of 4 to 5% of profits from any type of technology that's created from this system that would go back to the community, where now there's nothing at all.
Great, thank you. I think we have one more here, and then we're not going to push the buzzer again. Sorry.
Thank you both so much for your amazing work. I have a two-part question for Catherine. Is the cost of reusing materials greater than using the current system of demolition and new materials? And if so, do you foresee a system of material reuse reaching a cost-competitive scale in the future?
Thank you for your question. Well, I mean, the answer is it depends. It depends on...
Good answer, I like that. It's a very academic one. Well, it depends.
I mean, it depends how much your labor costs. So in Switzerland, labor is much more expensive than the materials. So here we are more inclined to demolish and just throw away our materials than in countries where materials are really expensive compared to the labor. And so that's why I am doing, or my team really, I should say, is doing all of this research on digital technologies, because we believe that if we make it easier to disassemble and distribute those reused materials, it will become cheaper, also here in Switzerland. And so we're trying to make it cheaper to reuse than to demolish, because that's the only way that's going to happen at a big scale.
Great answer, I like that. So we have now come to the end of our time. Because we have an apéro afterwards. Wait, we're not done. We're not quite done. We have an apéro. Wait. I have one question for you guys, for you girls, you ladies, you women. Not sure what. I grew up in the Midwest, and everyone, that's so. What gives you hope? Because when we look at the world, there's a lot which can get us pretty wrapped up in a wrong way at the moment. But what gives you hope? This gives me hope when I see this. It's beautiful. What gives you, as humans, what gives you hope?
I can go first.
Sure.
I think somewhat I have a privileged perspective because I get a lot of outreach and probably a lot of information about what's happening ahead of time. I mean, what gives me hope? I get emails from a girl in grade 6 from Australia who emailed me and said, can I talk to you about my school project? Because I'm looking at low-tech radical Indigenism and I want to write a report about it. Can I call you? And so you make time and then you talk to someone who's 11 years old and it's really inspiring. But I also think, you know, a lot of the time when you're in the midst of something that's incredibly confusing and incredibly hard and feels like that there's like an insurmountable mountain ahead of you, you're actually in the midst of something. And I really do believe that we're in the midst of one of the greatest epochs in humankind, I think even since colonization, really, where there's going to be an incredible shift that we're moving towards. And the shift is triggered and catalyzed by climate change, but I think it's a shift towards this universal alliance of humankind with planetary systems. And I think it's going to be hundreds of years, but I see it happening, and I think everybody should be aware and conscious of like what you're involved in and what you're engaged with.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this.
Catherine?
Similarly, what gives me hope is the reaction of my students and how much I learn from them and their activism and their curiosity and their engagement towards finding solutions for climate change, designing more climate resilience, and really, I mean, I showed some pictures of 5-year-old kids building, trying to learn about circular economy, and remembering when I was studying, I got interested in circular economy through my undergrad, and nobody knew what it meant. When I said that I was working on circular architecture, they thought I was working on round buildings, and of course,
Sometimes you are.
which, you know, it's confusing because I used to live in a yurt, but now I don't have to explain to it anymore, and I'm learning from these younger students, and they're so engaged towards the climate, and that really gives me hope. The next generation is really going to help also finding solutions, and it's really teaching me also a lot about technologies towards climate resilience.
That's great. I think I share. Thank you for both of those hopeful statements, and I share your. When I look at this room and I see you here, it gives me hope. Because you're here, because you care, you want to learn, you got curiosity, and we in this room are fortunate that we have the power to make change happen. This is why you're here and what we have. This is our gift, our opportunity, and our responsibility is to take that very seriously and to choose to matter, and you make those changes. And I want to thank both of you very, very much for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
For sharing your wisdom and your insights. I mean, really, this is really quite wonderful. I think drowning in knowledge, starving for wisdom is going to be one of my takeaways tonight. I think this is something for us really to take to heart, is where do we find those jewels of wisdom? I think, and both of you have shared those tonight. So let us give a nice ETH thank you to Julia and Catherine for your wisdom.